When the curtains lifted in the ocean breeze, I stood frozen as my own daughter told me, "We're leaving tomorrow, I sold your beach house." Still, I kept my fingers on the window frame, forcing the shock into silence instead of tears. As the curtains kept flapping, each slow rise felt like a reminder of everything she'd taken. While they breathed in and out, I realized she didn't see a mother anymore, just a resource to drain. The same soft rhythm sharpened my clarity. This betrayal wasn't accidental. That's when I decided I'd sell something she truly needed, and she'd never see it coming. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The sun hung low in the sky, its light bending gently over Marion Holt's porch where she sat in her wicker chair, feeling the day's heat fade into the cool promise of evening. Her hands, steady despite their age, held a mug of tea. The salt air filled her lungs with each breath. The ocean was just beyond the dunes, its rhythmic crash against the shore as constant as time itself. Marion let her eyes close for a moment, taking solace in the calm of the world around her. This house, this place, was all she had left of Charlie, of the life they built together. The thought of losing it felt almost too much to bear. She hadn't expected visitors. Not today, the quiet was something she savored now after so many years of noise and bustle. But then she heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching over gravel. A car pulled into the driveway, its engine cutting off with a suddenness that disrupted the tranquility. Marion didn't stir at first, still holding the mug in both hands. She recognized the vehicle before she even saw who it was, Emily, her daughter. A sigh escaped her lips. Slowly, Marion set the mug on the small table beside her. The mug trembled slightly from the force of her grip. Her daughter and son-in-law appeared in the doorway without a knock. Emily's face was unreadable, as it often was these days, but Marion could sense something different in her presence today. Jason stood a few steps behind, avoiding eye contact, his hands jammed into the pockets of his jeans, as he often did when he didn't want to face what was coming. "Mom, we need to talk," Emily said. There was no preamble, no greeting, just that. Marion's gaze flicked over to Jason, who remained silent, his expression tense. No surprise there. It was always Emily who spoke for both of them. She was the one who made decisions, even if those decisions weren't hers to make. Emily stepped forward, a clipboard in her hands as if she were there on business. She handed it to Marion with a swift motion, expecting immediate compliance. "We're leaving tomorrow," Emily said, her tone flat like she was announcing the weather. "I sold your beach house." Marion's breath caught, and for the briefest moment she thought she might drop the mug she had just set down. Her fingers twitched as though she might feel the heat of the tea spill over. She steadied herself, her mind scrambling to process the words. The beach house, the home Charlie built with his hands. The world around her shifted slightly, but she kept her face still, her features neutral as if none of this was happening. But inside, something stirred, something far colder than the air around her. She set her jaw and let her gaze meet Emily's. "Sold?" Marion's voice was even measured. "What do you mean sold?" Emily's lips twisted into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've already taken care of it. It's done. I'm moving you out tomorrow. It's time for you to go, Mom. You've been holding on to this place for far too long." Marion's pulse quickened, but she stayed calm. The house, her sanctuary, was being ripped from under her feet, but she wouldn't let Emily see her crumble. Jason stood by the car, his gaze flickering to Marion and back to the ground. His silence was loud, deafening, he knew, but he always knew when to stay out of the way. Marion stood slowly, her body stiff with restraint. She moved past Emily without a word, but the look in her eyes said everything. This was not over, it wouldn't be. Emily didn't move. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "I'll pack what I need," Marion said, her voice cold now, her calm demeanor never slipping. She glanced at the clipboard in Emily's hand, then back at her daughter's face. "But don't ever forget this was my home." Emily's mouth tightened, but she didn't respond. She simply turned and walked back to the car, Jason following her, silent as ever. As the door clicked shut behind them, Marion's breath came in shallow bursts. She didn't know what game Emily was playing, but she would play it better. For now, she had one thing left to do, prepare, and she would do it in her own time. The quiet returned to the porch, but the storm had already begun to brew. Marion stood at the threshold of her home, her heart as still as the sea, but her mind racing. The paper felt cold in Marion's hands as she stared at the document in front of her. The words blurred together for a moment, but it wasn't the content that unsettled her. It was the paper itself, the odd texture, the thickness that didn't match the usual legal forms she was familiar with. And then there was the signature. She leaned closer, the dim light from the hallway casting a soft glow across the page. Marion's eyes traced each letter, each curve of the ink strokes. The signature wasn't hers, and it certainly was Charlie's, not that she expected it to be. No, it was Emily's. The ink, a deep shade of black, didn't match the smooth, consistent flow of Marion's own handwriting. It was jagged in places and the strokes were too rushed, too forced, but what struck her immediately was the pen. A ballpoint of the kind Emily always carried in her purse, not the fine liner Marian preferred for legal matters. And the timestamp, it was wrong. A full 2 days after the supposed sale was finalized. Marian swallowed, her heart thudding in her chest. The chill of realization crept over her, colder than the evening air outside. This wasn't just a sale, it wasn't even a proper transaction. This was fraud. She steadied her breath, straightening her spine. This was not how she was going to let it end. Emily thought she could push her around, treat her like a helpless old woman, but she had underestimated Marian, and now it was time for a reckoning. The document lay heavily in her hands as she walked to the kitchen, her footsteps deliberate, echoing in the silence of the empty house. She found Emily sitting at the small table, her posture too relaxed, too self-assured for someone who had just dismantled their family's legacy. Emily barely glanced up when Marian entered the room, her fingers tapping lightly against the wood of the table as she skimmed through her phone. She'd clearly been expecting this confrontation, though she showed no real concern. "I saw the papers," Marian said, her voice flat. "The signature yours, the date's wrong, you forged my name." Emily's eyes flickered for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The smugness slipped just slightly before she regained her composure. "It's done, Mom," Emily said, her voice too calm, too practiced. "There's no need to make a scene. You signed it whether you remember or not, it's over." Marian's jaw tightened, the muscles in her face hardening as she tried to control the rising tide of anger inside her. This was no mistake. Emily had planned this, and she was using that same dismissive tone, the one she always used when she wanted to belittle Marian's every word. "I'll meet the buyers," Marian said, her eyes narrowing. Emily froze. For just a split second, she hesitated, her fingers faltering in midair as she reached for her phone again. Then she quickly recovered, leaning back in her chair, her gaze never meeting Marian's. "Not going to happen," Emily replied, her tone sharper than before. "The house is sold. The new owners are already moving in. There's no point in meeting them. It's done, just move on." Marian stood there, her fingers still gripping the paper. Her mind raced, trying to process every little detail, every small lie Emily had spun in her wake. She'd gotten away with it for now, but not for long. "Mom, don't make this harder than it has to be," Emily said, finally meeting her gaze. "It's not your home anymore, you're better off letting go." The words landed with the force of a slap, but Marian refused to show any emotion, refusing to let Emily see that she had been shaken even slightly. "Grandma," a small, hesitant voice spoke from the doorway, and Marian turned to see Tessa standing there, her eyes wide, her face pale. "I think Mom's hiding something." Tessa's words hung in the air for a long moment, her expression a mix of confusion and fear. She hadn't said much since Marian had arrived home earlier, but there was something in her voice now that made Marian's heart ache. Tessa knew, she knew what Emily was capable of, and she wasn't buying the lies. Marian's heart softened, but her resolve only hardened. Tessa was the one thing in this house that still mattered. Marian would protect her no matter what. She looked down at the forged document in her hand, then at Emily, who had become more and more defensive as the minutes passed. "I'm calling Paul," Marian said, her voice sharp, her decision final. "Paul Granger," Emily scoffed. "You really think he'll do anything? He's not going to stop this, it's done." "I don't care what you think," Marian replied, her voice as cold as the ocean wind outside. "I'm calling him, and you'll regret this." She turned to walk toward the phone in the other room, her mind already racing. She had a lawyer on her side now, someone who wouldn't be intimidated by Emily's schemes, someone who could find the cracks in the lies and make them crumble. Behind her, S.H. E could feel Emily's gaze burning into her back, but Marian didn't look back. The game had changed, and she would be the one to control the next move. As she dialed Paul's number, her fingers steady, Marian felt a rush of determination flood her chest. This was just the beginning, and soon Emily would see how far Marian was willing to go to protect everything she had left. The phone rang once, twice, then Paul's voice crackled through the line and Marian's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Paul," she said, her voice firm, "we need to talk." Marian's hands trembled slightly as she hung up the phone with Paul Granger. The details were starting to fall into place, but the weight of them pressed down on her chest. The house had been sold too quickly, too cheaply, to a shell company that didn't even exist in the real world. But the most damning revelation was the forgery, the power of attorney Emily had used, one that had been revoked years ago. Marian exhaled sharply. She had enough to take action now, but first there was one more thing she needed to do. Tessa had remained quiet, sitting at the kitchen table. Marian could see the concern in her granddaughter's eyes, the quiet weight of the situation heavy on her small shoulders. Tessa had always been perceptive, seeing things others missed. Marian didn't have the luxury of time. She needed answers, and she needed them now. "We're going for a drive," Marian said, her voice calm, though her mind was anything but. Tessa's eyes widened, but she said nothing, only nodding as she followed Marion outside. The air felt thick with impending change as Marion climbed into her car, Tessa silently sliding into the passenger seat beside her. The drive to the beach house was long and quiet. Marion's fingers gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale against the dark leather. She wasn't sure if it was the air or the memories that clouded her mind, but something felt different tonight. This was no longer just about a house. It was about her future, her freedom, and more importantly, her dignity. When they arrived, the sight of a strange car parked in front of the house immediately set her on edge. As Marion and Tessa approached, they saw two strangers standing on the porch, measuring the railing and jotting down notes. Marion's heart stilled for a moment. Her eyes narrowed, strangers in her home without her permission. She approached them, her steps firm but calm. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cutting through the quiet evening air. The two men turned, surprised by her sudden appearance. One of them hesitated before speaking. "We're just measuring for renovations," he said quickly, as if that should explain everything. Marion didn't wait for more. "Who hired you?" she asked, her voice sharp. Before the man could respond, Emily's voice rang out from behind them. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Her tone was too sweet, too rehearsed. Marion didn't turn around, her focus still on the strangers. "I'm asking questions, Emily. Who authorized this?" Emily stepped forward, arms crossed. "They're just contractors, there's no need to make a scene." "No need to make a scene," Marion repeated, her voice low but firm. "This is my home, Emily, and you've sold it without my permission." The men shifted uncomfortably, but Emily held her ground. "They're just doing their job, Mom." But Marion could see the cracks in her daughter's composure. Emily was lying, and the walls she'd built around her deception were crumbling. Marion turned, meeting her daughter's eyes with a calm intensity. "I'll be getting my house back, Emily, one way or another." The storm that had been gathering within her was no longer something to fear. Marion knew now this wasn't over, not yet. The house felt emptier now, its once familiar corners casting long shadows under the weak light from a single lamp. Marion stood at the threshold of her living room, her fingers lingering on the doorframe as she watched Emily, her daughter, box up Marion's life. The sight of it, Emily rifling through drawers, pulling out dishes, books, old family photographs, was a visceral blow. Every item in those boxes was a memory, and now Emily was treating them like trash. Marion didn't make a sound at first. She just watched, her eyes narrowing slightly as Emily worked quickly, packing things away with that forced determination as though she were doing something good for Marion. She didn't speak. Her hands moved mechanically, tossing anything of value into boxes without a thought. Her daughter was stealing her life, piece by piece, and Marion's silence was the only thing standing between this quiet devastation and her own rage. "Mom, don't be so stubborn," Emily's voice rang out, harsh and unyielding. "You've got to move on, it's time, you're not getting any younger." The words stung, but Marion didn't react. She simply walked into the room, her footsteps heavy on the creaky floorboards. Emily barely glanced up, absorbed in her work. She picked up a vase that had once sat on the kitchen counter, its surface chipped but still beloved by Marion. She held it in her hands and shrugged. "This thing's a mess, Mom. You never really cared about it anyway," Emily muttered, tossing it carelessly into a box with a clatter. Marion's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Instead, she began to move, her steps slow but deliberate. She opened the first drawer and began pulling out small items, an old keychain, a letter she had never opened, a stack of photographs she had meant to frame. She didn't pack them, she didn't wrap them in tissue paper. She simply removed them from the boxes Emily had packed, placing them carefully in a small pile beside her. She wasn't rushing, wasn't frantic, just calm, quietly reclaiming what was hers. Tessa entered the room, standing quietly in the doorway. Marion could feel her granddaughter's gaze on her, feel the silent understanding that passed between them. Tessa was the only one who hadn't been swept up in this mess. She hadn't become part of Emily's world of lies and manipulation. Without a word, Tessa moved to Marion's side. She picked up a few of the smaller items Marion had set aside, old picture frames, a weathered journal, a few coins that had once belonged to Charlie, and placed them gently into the bag Marion had started. "I'm not going anywhere," Tessa whispered, her voice barely audible. It was as if she were speaking to herself as much as to Marion, but Marion heard the quiet rebellion in her words. Emily huffed, turning to glare at them. "Stop this," she snapped. "You're not helping, you're just making it harder. You've got to accept it, Mom. I sold the house, it's over." Marion paused for a moment, then stood up straight, meeting her daughter's eyes. "It's not over, Emily, not by a long shot." The words were soft, but they carried weight, like a promise of things to come. The silence between them stretched, heavy and thick, but Marion broke it first. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, dialed the number she had been avoiding for days. When the line clicked, she spoke firmly into the receiver. "Hello, I need to file a fraud report." Her voice was steady, calm, a far cry from the woman Emily expected her to be, but this was no longer about saving face or holding back. Emily had taken too much. Now Marion was going to take it back. She didn't say much more to the police, only that she'd be in touch later with the full details. Her decision had been made. As she hung up, her gaze lingered on the boxes Emily had filled. It was all happening too fast, too neatly. It made Marion feel as if the life she'd built was slipping through her fingers even as she held onto it. But there was a quiet power in letting Emily make her move too soon, because now Marion would be one step ahead. The sound of the front door opening interrupted her thoughts. The police were on their way, they'd be here soon to start the investigation. Paul's injunction papers would follow after that. The pieces were falling into place. Emily walked past her again, trying to act unaffected. But Marion could see the worry creeping into her daughter's eyes, the flicker of doubt. She wasn't as certain now, not like she had been before. The weight of the night pressed down on Marion as she walked into the kitchen, standing at the center of her home. The empty walls, the boxes stacked high, it was a place that had once been full of life, but not anymore. Marion took a deep breath, letting the familiar scent of the house fill her lungs for what might be the last time. She glanced at Tessa, who stood just behind her. "We'll be fine," Marion said softly, as if to reassure both of them. The sun had long since set, the house now cloaked in darkness, but Marion didn't feel afraid. She felt ready. This wasn't the end of anything, it was the beginning. And she would not let her daughter win, not this time, not ever again. Marion sat at her kitchen table, the shadows of the night settling deeper around her. Tessa had long since gone to bed, the house quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. The boxes, packed and stacked high, seemed to loom around her, an oppressive reminder of the chaos Emily had begun. But Marion's mind was elsewhere, consumed by the phone call she had just received from Paul Granger. Her hands were steady as she cradled the phone, but the weight of what Paul had revealed pressed heavily on her chest. She had suspected Emily of many things, but this was something else. "It's worse than I thought," Paul had said. "Someone filed for eldercare benefits in your name, Marion. I've got the documents here, you need to see them." The words had felt like a punch to the gut. Marion wasn't naive. She had known for some time that Emily's manipulations were escalating, but this, using Marion's name to claim benefits under the guise of her mental decline, was something she hadn't expected. Now, as the documents lay spread out before her on the table, Marion could see the full scope of Emily's plan. Medical claims filled the pages, reports that labeled Marion as mentally incompetent, as though she were some frail, confused woman incapable of making decisions. The words were like poison dripping onto the page, but it was the doctor's signature that hit Marion the hardest, a signature she didn't recognize. "Forged," she whispered aloud, her voice trembling with rage and disbelief. How far had Emily gone? To make sure she gained access to Marion's assets, she had not only falsified paperwork for the house but had also gone so far as to stage a medical crisis. It was too much. This wasn't just a scheme, it was an all-out assault on her very identity. Marion's fingers gripped the edges of the documents as though she could crush the truth out of them. Her stomach twisted into knots, but she refused to let the fear settle in. This was exactly what Emily wanted, for her to feel helpless, defeated, but Marion wasn't helpless. Not anymore. She dialed Paul's number once again, her fingers moving with purpose. "Paul," she said, her voice firm, "we need to move forward with this. A countersuit, I won't let her get away with it. If she thinks she can make me out to be some vulnerable old woman, she's mistaken." Paul's voice came through, calm and reassuring. "I've already started looking into it. This is medical fraud, Marion. We've got everything we need to expose it." Marion closed her eyes, listening to his words. The world outside the walls of her house felt distant, but here in the quiet, with the evidence laid out in front of her, she was ready. The truth was on her side, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. "I'm going to the police," she said, her voice resolute. "I'm filing a report on the fraud. This stops now." "Good," Paul replied. "The authorities need to get involved, and with the forgeries and the eldercare claim, it's all connected. We'll get this sorted." As Marion hung up the phone, she stood slowly, her gaze drifting over the evidence on the table. The betrayal was deeper than anything she could have imagined. Emily had tried to strip away everything, the house, her identity, her dignity, but she hadn't counted on Marion's will. Marion moved to the window, her reflection faint in the glass as she looked out into the night. The stars were hidden behind clouds, but the wind carried a familiar scent of salt and sea, grounding her. This was her home, her life. She wasn't about to let Emily take it. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence. A chill ran down Marion's spine. She wasn't expecting anyone, but she knew that with everything going on, it could only be one thing. She opened the door to find two police officers standing on the doorstep. Their faces were grim, and the seriousness in their eyes made Marion's pulse quicken. "Mrs. Holt," one of the officers asked, his voice low. "Yes," Marion replied, her hands steady on the doorframe. "We need to talk to you about some documents we've recovered," the officer continued. It looks like there's been a case of medical fraud and we need your statement. Marian's breath caught in her chest, but she didn't hesitate. Come in, she said, stepping aside. It's time. As the officers entered, the gravity of the situation settled over Marian once more. She had known Emily's betrayal ran deep, but now the full extent of it was unfolding. This was only the beginning, and Marian wasn't about to let it end until she had everything back, every last shred of control that had been taken from her. She stood tall, her eyes locked with the officers as he placed the documents on the table, the papers that had been forged, the lies, the betrayal. It wasn't over, not yet, and Marian was ready to fight. The courthouse was cold, the sterile chill of the marble floors making Marian's every step sound louder than it should. She moved with purpose, her heels clicking against the stone, a steady rhythm that marked her determination. Today wasn't about waiting, it was about taking back control. She spotted Emily and Jason in the hallway, sitting side by side, their heads bent in quiet conversation. Emily was trying to appear composed, but the tension in her posture gave her away. Jason looked uncomfortable, his hands fidgeting in his lap. It was clear that they thought today would go according to their plan, that Marian would be the one to crumble. But Marian wasn't here to break, she was here to stand tall. The courtroom doors opened and Marian walked in, her spine straight, her presence commanding. She was dressed flawlessly in a navy suit, her silver hair neatly pulled back, looking every bit the woman she was, strong, composed, and ready. She wasn't here to let Emily turn her into a helpless old woman. Not now, not ever. The judge glanced up as she entered, his gaze flicking between Marian and Emily. The room was quiet, the tension thick. Emily's eyes narrowed when she saw Marian's calm confidence, but she didn't speak. She was still trying to sell the illusion, but Marian knew the truth would prevail. Paul Granger, her lawyer, spoke first, laying out the facts with precision. He explained the fraudulent documents Emily had submitted, claiming Marian was mentally incompetent. He emphasized that there had been no medical evidence to support these claims, only forged papers and manipulated records. Marian's eyes never left the judge as Paul spoke, her heart steady with the knowledge that she was in the right. When the judge turned to Emily, his voice was sharp. Ms. Holt, is this true? He asked, his gaze hardening. Emily didn't flinch, but her jaw tightened. My mother's memory has been slipping. She forgets things all the time, Your Honor. I'm only trying to protect her. Jason added softly, she's had a lot of trouble lately. She's been forgetting things and we've had to step in. Paul cut him off. There is no official diagnosis of cognitive decline, Your Honor. This is a baseless claim intended to give Ms. Turner control over her mother's assets. The judge looked at the papers Paul had presented, then back at Emily. His expression shifted and Marian saw the judgment forming. I will not entertain a case built on fraudulent documents, he said, his voice firm. The petition for guardianship is denied. Marian held her breath as the judge's words echoed in the room. Emily's face faltered for a moment, her carefully crafted mask slipping, but she quickly regained her composure. She glanced at Marian, fury flashing in her eyes. Marian didn't blink, she didn't even react. She simply stood, gathered her things, and walked past Emily with quiet dignity. The court was hers now, and Emily's plans had been dismantled piece by piece. As Marian stepped out of the courtroom, she felt a surge of relief, but also something deeper, victory. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but Marian Holt had just shown her daughter that some things couldn't be taken away, not without a fight. Marian stood in the living room, watching as two uniformed officers moved through Emily's house, carefully placing documents into evidence bags. The hum of the evening had returned to the streets outside, but inside the atmosphere was thick with tension. Emily's house, once full of bustling noise and false cheer, now felt hollow, an empty shell. One of the officers, a tall woman with a dark ponytail, was sifting through a pile of receipts and credit card statements spread across the coffee table. Marian could see the sharp lines of stress etched into her face, the silent acknowledgement of what they were uncovering. Beside her, a younger officer began going through a stack of emails on Emily's computer, clicking through them with practiced precision. Marian hadn't wanted to be here, but it was necessary. After everything, after Emily's lies, her fraud, her attempts to manipulate Marian's life and legacy, there had to be consequences. The officer paused, turning toward Marian. We've found evidence that Emily used the proceeds from the beach house sale to cover some significant credit card debt, the woman said, her voice professional but laced with disbelief. It looks like she was trying to pay down over $100,000 in outstanding balances. Marian nodded, her jaw tight. The beach house, the one thing she had left from Charlie, had been the key to Emily's scheme. Marian had known her daughter was in financial trouble, but this was far beyond what she had imagined. Emily had taken everything from the house sale and used it to pay off her own mess, leaving Marian to pick up the pieces. I knew she'd get desperate, Marian murmured to herself, more to steady her own thoughts than to seek comfort. But the thought of her daughter's lies, of how deep the manipulation had gone, made the bitter taste of betrayal all the more acute. The younger officer stepped forward, holding up a folder of printed emails. You might want to take a look at these, he said, handing the pages to Marion. Marion took the papers, her hands trembling slightly as she scanned the screen-printed messages. Emily had been in frequent contact with Jason, urging him to sign documents that would give them control over Marion's assets, pressuring him to back up the fraudulent house sale. The tone of the emails, persistent, forceful, was chilling. Emily had been pushing Jason to the breaking point, cornering him into participating in her scheme. Marion's eyes burned with a mix of anger and sorrow as she read the words. Jason was complicit, not because he was malicious, but because Emily had made him believe there was no other way out. That thought hurt more than anything. The doorbell rang, breaking the moment. Marion turned, startled, her pulse quickening. She hadn't been expecting anyone else. Tessa stood in the doorway, her face pale, her body trembling. Her eyes met Marion S. with a quiet pain that made Marion's chest tighten. Without a word, Tessa crossed the room and walked straight into Marion's arms. The weight of the situation seemed to descend all at once, and Marion held her granddaughter, steadying her as her small body shook with sobs. I don't know what to do, Tessa whispered, her voice cracking. Mom, she said you'd be dead before I was 18, she said that. Marion's breath hitched in her throat as her fingers gently brushed through Tess. Saw's hair, the pain in her granddaughter's words, was a raw wound that pierced deep into Marion's heart. She had never imagined Emily would go so far, never thought her daughter's resentment could stretch to this. But hearing Tessa's words, hearing what Emily had said, was a revelation. It was a confession without a confession. Marion tightened her hold on Tessa, feeling the weight of everything fall onto her shoulders. How had it come to this? I'm here, Tessa, Marion whispered, her voice low and steady. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. The officers finished their work, leaving Marion and Tessa alone in the silence of the room. The house felt heavier than before, as if every item around them carried the weight of Emily's betrayals. Yet amidst the shattered pieces, Marion found a quiet strength rising in her chest. She wasn't done yet. There was more to uncover, more to fix. And Emily would answer for this. Marion turned back to the evidence on the table. Paul had already been preparing a countersuit, and now, with the documents the police had recovered, the pieces were falling into place. Emily's access to Marion's accounts would be frozen within hours. The fraud was clear, the manipulation evident. The authorities were on her side now. But the last sting of betrayal still lingered, a sharp edge that cut deeper with each passing second. Marion straightened up. We're not finished, she said, her voice colder now but determined. Not by a long shot. And as she stood, with Tessa at her side, Marion knew that the storm was just beginning. Marion sat at the kitchen table, the dim light from Paul's laptop casting harsh shadows on her face. The footage of Emily's frantic transfers flickered on the screen. There was no doubt now. Emily had been draining Marion's account, stealing the last remnants of the life she had tried to protect. The footage was grainy, but it was undeniable. Emily's hands moved quickly, nervously, typing in account numbers, transferring money in large sums as if she were running out of time. Paul leaned over Marion's shoulder, his fingers already moving to file an emergency freeze on the accounts. I've locked the primary accounts. We've managed to freeze about half the funds before she could move them offshore, he said, his voice calm, though the urgency was clear in his eyes. Marion exhaled slowly, trying to suppress the wave of anger rising inside her. She thought she could just take it all, Marion thought bitterly. The beach house, her sanctuary, the last piece of Charlie she had left, had been sold, the proceeds funneled into paying off Emily's spiraling credit card debt. The realization stung, but Marion wouldn't let it break her. Not now, not ever. I knew she'd go this far, Marion said softly, more to herself than to Paul. But even as she said it, something darker settled in her heart. The house was gone, but it wasn't just about money. It was about control, her control. As Marion stared at the screen, the doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She stood, a sense of dread gnawing at her insides. Who could it be now? Tessa stood in the doorway, her face pale, her body trembling. Without a word, she crossed the room and stepped into Marion's arms. The moment her granddaughter clung to her, Marion felt the full weight of the situation. I don't know what to do, Tessa whispered, her voice cracking. Mom said you'd be dead before I was 18, she said that. Marion's breath caught. The words stung, but it wasn't the shock, it was the truth behind them. Emily had spoken that to Tessa, filled her mind with doubt and hurt, poisoning the one thing Marion had left to protect. Tessa. Holding her granddaughter close, Marion fought back the sting in her eyes. I'm here, Tessa, she whispered. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. The weight of the words was heavy, but Marion's resolve was even stronger. Emily had gone too far this time, not just for the money, but for the devastation she had left behind. As the officers finished gathering evidence, Marion turned back to the pile of documents on the table. She wasn't finished. There was still work to do. Emily would pay for this, Marion thought with quiet fury. She will regret this. Paul was already preparing the next steps, freezing Emily's access to Marion's accounts and initiating a countersuit. But Marion knew this was only the beginning. It was time for the long game now. "We're not finished," Marion said, her voice firm, colder now with determination. "Not by a long shot." And with Tessa at her side, Marion began to craft her next move, a long-term revenge, legal and elegant but absolute. Emily's world was about to collapse, and Marion would be the one to bring it down. The day had started like any other, but it didn't take long for everything to change. Marion was standing by the kitchen window, Tessa at her side, when the phone rang. The sound of it seemed to echo through the house, sharp and insistent. Marion didn't hesitate. She knew it was Paul. "Marion, you need to sit down." Paul's voice came through the line, tight and urgent. "Emily's been arrested." Marion's breath caught in her throat. "What, arrested? Where?" "On her way out of state," Paul continued. "She tried to cross into Virginia. She was heading for the border. Police intercepted her at a checkpoint. She was carrying forged documents, a stack of cash, and an itinerary that doesn't look good." Marion's pulse quickened as she tried to process the words. Emily had tried to run. For years, Marion had suspected something like this was coming, but hearing the reality hit her like a slap in the face. Her daughter, the woman she had tried to protect, was cornered. "And Jason?" Marion asked, her voice trembling though she fought to keep it steady. "I'm going to need you to brace yourself," Paul said softly. Jason confessed. He told them everything about the fraud, the forgery, the house sale. He said Emily had been planning to liquidate all of your assets for years. She was going to leave you with nothing. The weight of Paul's words felt like an anchor pulling Marion deeper into the sea of betrayal. For so long, she had fought to keep her family together, to protect her granddaughter, to shield them from the chaos Emily had brought into their lives. And now, with the truth laid bare, it felt like everything was unraveling. Tessa looked up at her grandmother, confusion and fear swimming in her eyes. "What's happening, Grandma? Where's Mom going?" Marion's throat tightened. She knelt down, pulling Tessa close, feeling the tremor in her granddaughter's body. "Emily tried to run, Tessa," Marion whispered. "She tried to leave, but the police stopped her. She's in jail now." The room seemed to close in on Marion as she held Tessa. The sound of sirens in the distance was replaced by the weight of the silence. The pieces were falling into place. Emily's plan was coming apart at the seams. "The house," Marion said, her voice low but determined. "We'll get the house back, Tessa, I promise you." The news hit like a second wave. Within hours of Emily's arrest, the court had reversed the sale of the house. Marion's lawyer had moved quickly, filing motions and presenting evidence of the fraud. The documents Emily had forged were now proof of her intent to steal, to manipulate, to destroy. Marion stood up slowly, her grip on the phone tightening. "The house is ours again," she told Tessa, a fierce resolve in her voice. "Emily thought she could take everything from me, but she was wrong." Later that afternoon, Marion sat in her living room, the space now filled with the weight of both grief and triumph. She had fought so long for this house, for the legacy of Charlie, for the stability she had worked so hard to build. And now, despite everything, it was back in her hands. The phone rang again, breaking the silence. It was Emily, her voice cold and bitter through the receiver. "You think you've won, don't you?" Emily's voice dripped with venom. "You've taken everything from me. You ruined me, Marion." Marion stared at the phone, her fingers steady as she held it in her grip. For a moment she considered answering, but she didn't. She wasn't interested in more of Emily's lies. Emily was in jail, her world was crumbling around her, and it was her own doing. Marion set the phone down, turning to Tessa, who was sitting quietly at the table, her face still pale from the morning's events. But in Tessa's eyes, Marion saw something that gave her hope, strength, a quiet defiance. She wasn't the only one who had been hurt by Emily. "We'll be okay, Tessa," Marion said softly, reaching for her granddaughter's hand. "We'll rebuild together." And as Marion looked out the window, watching the last light of day fade behind the hills, she knew that Emily's world had finally come crashing down. The storm was over, and Marion was standing, unbroken, ready for whatever came next. The house was quiet, the soft hum of the evening only broken by Marion's breathing as she sat at the kitchen table. The pile of papers before her felt heavier than it should, their weight somehow more suffocating than any of the betrayals she had faced. The documents were Charlie's, old, forgotten, but now, after all that had happened, crucial. As she flipped through the pages, something caught her eye. Buried in the middle of one of the legal documents was a clause that she hadn't seen before, one that Emily had likely never considered. The trust. The future trust. It was to be given to Emily upon her 45th birthday, but only if Marion approved. The words hit her like a cold wave. Emily had been counting on this. For years, Marion realized. The trust was her safety net, her escape plan. She desold the beach house, drained Marion's accounts, and manipulated everyone into believing she was the victim, all to position herself for this money. It was a plan so twisted, so calculated that Marion almost couldn't believe it. The betrayal was far deeper than she had known, but now Marion saw clearly. Emily had used every lie, every forged document just to reach this trust, to escape the financial chaos she'd created for herself. Mom said that money was her escape plan, Tessa whispered from behind her. Marion hadn't noticed her granddaughter standing there, but Tessa's words struck deep. Emily's plan wasn't just about money, it was about survival at the expense of everyone else. Marion stood up, her fingers gripping the papers tightly. This ends now. She picked up the phone, her voice steady as she called Paul. I've found it, the trust. Emily's been planning this for years, but I can dissolve it, can't I? Paul's response was immediate. We'll take care of it, Marion. We'll make sure she doesn't get a cent. This ends now. Marion sat back, her mind racing. Emily's last hope, her escape, was slipping away, and Marion, once the victim, was now in control. With a quiet resolve, Marion began drafting the paperwork. This wasn't just about the money. This was about ensuring Emily could never hurt her or anyone else again. The storm was far from over, but this time Marion was the one wielding the thunder. The funds from the trust had been liquidated swiftly, all moved into Marion's estate account. The feeling of control was sharper than Marion expected. The trust that Emily had believed was her safety net, her final escape from the financial mess she'd created, was now dissolved, leaving her with nothing. Marion sat at the kitchen table, the numbers on the screen before her telling a story of triumph and loss, but mostly it was a story of control. Emily had underestimated her mother, thinking the money would slip through Marion's fingers as easily as it had slipped through her own. But now the trust was gone, and with it, Emily's hope for a way out. Hours later, Marion found the letter from Emily in her mailbox. She could already guess its contents, but the bitterness in her daughter's words still cut deep. You ruined me. You took everything. I hope you can live with yourself. Marion folded the letter slowly, the anger it stirred inside her muted by a kind of cold clarity. This was Emily's doing, her choices. Marion had simply stopped enabling them. She set the letter aside and her gaze drifted to Tessa, who was sitting at the table, quietly reading. Tessa had heard the news of Emily's arrest and the reversal of the house sale. Despite the chaos, there was something calming in the air now. They were safe. The fear was starting to fade from Tessa's eyes. I'm sorry, Grandma, Tessa murmured, her voice breaking the silence. Marion walked over and sat beside her, her hand on Tessa's shoulder. You have nothing to be sorry for, Marion said softly. You didn't do anything wrong. You've been my strength through all of this. Tessa looked up at her, her expression softening. I just don't want to lose you. Marion smiled, brushing a tear from Tessa's cheek. You won't. You're staying with me now, always. The house might have been empty without Emily, but it was full now. Full of hope, full of promise. Emily's plans had unraveled, but Marion's future was just beginning to take shape. And as Marion thought about the community arts program she'd fund with the trust money, she knew the next chapter would be one of ailing in purpose, not revenge. The storm was over, they were free. The courtroom was silent as Marion took the stand. Her heart was steady, her voice even, though the weight of the moment pressed down on her. Emily, sitting across the room, stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and fury, but Marion didn't flinch. She had been through the worst of it. This was the final act. The prosecutor outlined the charges: fraud, forgery, elder exploitation. The evidence against Emily was undeniable: documents she had forged, funds she had stolen, lies she had woven. Marion spoke calmly, recounting the betrayal, the manipulation, and the emotional toll it had taken on her. This wasn't just about money, Marion said, her voice clear. It was about control. She wanted to take everything from me: my home, my life, my dignity. She thought I would just let her do it, but she underestimated me. Jason's turn on the stand came next, his voice shaky but resolute as he confessed to his role in the scheme. He corroborated Emily's lies, but there was a clear sense of guilt in his words. Marion had never been certain whether he had been a willing participant or a victim of Emily's manipulation. Today, his words seemed to confirm the latter. Then came Tessa. Marion held her breath as her granddaughter was called to the stand. Tessa had been through so much already. The tears in her eyes made Marion's heart ache, but Tessa was stronger than anyone had given her credit for. She made me believe it was Grandma's fault, Tessa said, her voice small but firm. She told me we'd be better off without her. She made me feel like everything was falling apart because of Grandma. The words hung in the air, raw and real. Emily looked away, guilt flashing across her face for the briefest moment. The emotional manipulation was now undeniable. The judge's voice broke the silence. The evidence against you is clear and the harm you've caused is significant, he said, his tone cold. You will be sentenced to 15 years in prison. As Emily was led away in handcuffs, Marion felt the weight of the finality sink in. Emily had lost everything, and Marion, though scarred, was free. Tessa moved to her side, and Marion held her close, the storm finally over. The gavel had dropped, but for Marion, the true weight of her victory began only after the courtroom cleared. The heavy silence in her home was no longer filled with the anticipation of what was coming next. The storm had passed. Now it was time to rebuild. Marion sat at her desk, a calm determination in her chest as she looked through the paperwork Paul had brought over. The permanent no-contact orders were first. She signed each one with the smooth, deliberate stroke of a woman who had learned how to protect herself. Emily's manipulation had crossed every boundary, and Marian was determined to make sure her daughter could never again disrupt the peace she had fought so hard to reclaim. Once the papers were signed, Marian felt a strange sense of finality. Emily would not have the chance to ever harm her or Tessa again. The door was firmly closed. Then, with a steady hand, Marian turned to her will. It was time for one final act of defiance against the daughter who had once been everything to her. Emily would receive nothing. The house, the savings, everything Marian had built would now go to Tessa. Marian paused for a moment, her fingers lingering on the pen, her thoughts flickering to the past. She had once believed that family was the most important thing, but that belief had been shattered by Emily's greed and manipulation. Tessa was the future now, and Marian had made sure the legacy she left would be one of strength, not of betrayal. When the will was complete, Marian felt lighter, the chains of the past loosened. She turned her attention to the remaining remnants of Emily's influence, her childhood items. Marian knew that Emily had always planned to reclaim these, but now they were hers to do with as she pleased. The old journals, the worn-out toys, the trophies that had once seemed so important, all of it was packed into boxes, ready to be sold. It wasn't about revenge, not anymore. It was about closing chapters, about making sure nothing of Emily's stayed behind in her home, no lingering ties that could drag Marian back into the chaos. The house, the memories, the belongings, they were all being cleared out, erased. The next day, Marian sat with Paul once again, going over the last of the financial ties that bound her to Emily. They closed the accounts, severed the connections that had allowed Emily to manipulate her finances. The last shared credit card, the joint bank accounts, all of it was gone. She was free, truly free. Marian glanced at Tessa, who was sitting at the table, playing with the small trinkets Marian had given her. The girl had been through so much, yet Marian saw the resilience in her. Tessa was starting therapy, a first step toward healing, toward learning how to trust. Again, slowly, she was finding her footing, no longer the frightened girl who had been manipulated by her mother's lies. In a quiet moment, Marian pulled out the small guide she had been working on for months, Elder Fraud Prevention. She had poured her experience into these pages, hoping to spare someone else the pain she had endured. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was her way of making sure no one else would fall victim to the same deceitful schemes that had ruined her family. Marian closed the guide, her resolve clear. She would continue to fight for what was right, to protect herself and Tessa from the harm that people like Emily sought to inflict. And as the sun began to set outside, casting a warm glow through the windows, Marian stood up, looking at the home she had rebuilt. It was a symbol of strength, of resilience. The past was gone and the future was full of possibilities. Her family was safe now and she had found her peace. But as Marian looked out the window, she couldn't help but feel the stirrings of something else, a quiet satisfaction, knowing that no matter what came next, she was ready. The storm was over, but Marian Holt, she was just getting started. The phone rang at 3 a.m., its shrill sound cutting through the silence of Marian's home. The world outside was dark, still, and quiet, but inside her home, Marian's heart began to race. She glanced at the caller ID before she even picked up. It was the prison. Emily. Her breath caught for a moment, but she didn't reach for the phone. She just stared at the screen. Emily had been trying to reach her for days, leaving voice messages, pleading for help. The calls had started shortly after the sentencing, but Marian hadn't answered a single one. And she wasn't going to answer this one either. Marian sat there, the phone vibrating in her hand, the temptation to pick it up almost overwhelming. But then she thought of Tessa, her granddaughter who had been through so much, and the thought of what Emily had put them both through. No, this is the final line, Marian told herself. With one swift motion, Marian pressed the button to block the number. It felt like a small, simple action, but in that moment it felt monumental. A door closed, a chapter finished. She put the phone down on the table and stood up. The room was dark, but through the window she could see the faintest light of dawn beginning to break through the horizon. It was the start of something new. Tessa was still asleep in her room, a peaceful quiet now settling over her. The girl had begun thriving at school again, her teachers had noticed a shift in her behavior. The trembling, fearful child who had once flinched at every word from Emily had been replaced by someone stronger. Tessa was beginning to open up, to laugh, to live again. Marian smiled to herself, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. This was her reward, the one thing that had made the pain bearable. Tessa was healing, they were healing, and nothing, no one was going to take that away. As the morning light filled the room, Marian sat back down at her desk, the small guide she'd written about elder fraud prevention sitting open in front of her. She had received a call from the local paper the day before asking to cover her work. They wanted to hear her story, how she had taken the strength she had found and turned it into something that could protect others from the same fate she had endured. Marian ran her fingers over the words she had written. She had poured her heart into the guide, using her experiences to help others. It wasn't just about vengeance anymore. It was about ensuring that what happened to her didn't happen to anyone else. She closed the guide and set it aside, her mind already shifting. She hadn't painted in years, but today felt different. She found her old easel tucked away in the corner of the room, covered in dust but still sturdy. The canvas stared at her, a blank slate. Marian picked up the brush, her hand steady as she dipped it in the paint. The strokes were slow at first, unsure, but with each movement, the years of grief, of pain, of loss began to pour out onto the canvas. She wasn't painting for anyone but herself. She was painting for her soul. As the colors came together, so did Marian. She wasn't just the woman who had lost everything. She was the woman who had found herself again. She was a mother, a grandmother, a survivor. Later that day, as she cleaned up her brushes, the doorbell rang. Paul stood in the doorway, holding an envelope in his hand, her final estate binder. He had done the paperwork for her, wrapping up the last of the legal matters. It was all finally settled. Marian's life, her legacy, was now hers to shape, free from the shackles of Emily's manipulation. "Thank you," Marian said, taking the binder from him. There was a sense of closure in his eyes, too. He had been there every step of the way, a quiet ally in the battle. Paul gave her a small nod, his expression unreadable. "You've done the hard part, now you get to live." Marian didn't need to say anything. They both knew that this was the beginning of something new. As Paul left, Marian glanced at the binder one last time. Emily had lost, and Marian was free. She stood at the window, watching the sun fully rise, her future stretching before her like an open road. The call that she had refused was one last cry from the past, and Marian, with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years, knew that she had truly closed the door on it forever. She was ready for whatever came next. The paperwork was signed, the trust was dissolved, and now Marian stood in her office, watching as the final transaction processed on the computer screen. The funds from the dissolved trust, once Emily's last hope for escape, were now permanently directed into a new account, one set aside for Tessa's future. Marian exhaled slowly, her eyes fixed on the screen. The funds, once a symbol of greed and manipulation, now stood as a foundation for the future she had built with love, determination, and sacrifice. No more manipulation, no more fear. Tessa would have the stability she deserved, the education, the opportunities that Marian had fought for her entire life. As the confirmation of the sale flashed on the screen, Marian closed her eyes. The past felt distant now, like a storm she had weathered and left behind. She turned toward the window, the soft glow of the afternoon sun filtering through the blinds. The house, her home, was more than just a physical space. It was the symbol of everything she had rebuilt, the strength that came from surviving. Tessa appeared in the doorway, her face lit up with that same spark of life Marian had seen in her for weeks now. The transformation had been remarkable. Where there was once fear, now there was confidence. Tessa was no longer the fragile child who had been forced to bear the weight of Emily's lies. She was thriving. Marian smiled as Tessa walked into the room, her arms opening for the hug that always felt like home. Tessa wrapped her arms tightly around Marian's waist, her voice muffled but filled with gratitude. "You saved me, Grandma." Marian squeezed her granddaughter back, feeling the weight of her words sink into her heart. "I saved you, but you saved me too." The bond between them was stronger than any manipulation Emily could have ever imposed. Together, they had survived the storm, and together they were stronger for it. As Tessa pulled away, Marian reached for the small journal she kept beside her desk. She hadn't written in it for months, but today she felt the need to capture the moment. She picked up the pen and began to write. "I kept what mattered. I lost a daughter, but I found my strength. I lost my beach house, but I built something far more lasting. And in the end, it wasn't about revenge. It was about peace. It was about protecting the one thing I never lost, my family." She set the pen down, reading over the words with a quiet satisfaction. The journey had been long, painful, but now it felt complete. Everything was in its place. The phone rang, pulling her out of her thoughts. She knew the number before she even looked at it. Emily. Marian didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. Later, as Marian stood on the porch, looking out over the yard that had been meticulously restored, she felt a wave of peace wash over her. The house was quieter now, more serene, but it was hers to shape, to protect, and to nurture. Behind her, Tessa stood, her voice quiet but full of love. "Grandma, do you think Mom will ever get out?" Marian turned, her eyes soft but resolute. "She'll have to figure that out on her own, sweetie. We have our own future now, and I'm going to make sure it's everything you need." Tessa nodded, a small smile playing on her lips as she hugged Marian once more. Later that day, Marian sent the final notice. No benefits, no trust, no inheritance. It was Emily's last blow, and Marian made sure it landed where it hurt the most. The chapter was closed, the storm had passed, and as Marian finally allowed herself to relax, the sense of calm washed over her completely. Emily had sold her beach house, so Marian had sold something Emily needed. And Marian slept just fine.